Dr.B.R.Ambedkar Memorial Lecture organized by Forum for Ambedkar's Thought at Nalsar University. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have here with us Prof.Mohan Gopal. Sir, it's indeed a privilege to have you in our midst. And now I request the Honorable Vice Chancellor to present our bouquet. Contemporary Studies. And he's been a former director for National Law School of India University and is former director for National Judicial Academy, India, Local. And then he was part of the members' inquiry committee appointed by the Rajya and then he was a member council and chairman for the finance committee in the Institute of Advanced Studies, Shilla. And he's been a counsel for the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, the legal counsel for these banks. Ladies and gentlemen, giving an insight into today's lecture, it is noticed that the society is becoming increasingly culturally imperialistic, as we find customs, traditions, and good habits of the minorities attacked by the society. Events such as Gujarat, Kanamal, and the 1984 Delhi, and also Bathanitola or Kailanj and Dharamchadu. Ambedkar increasingly focused on the welfare and the development of the minorities. Even said this even in the Constitutional Assembly, when he was introducing the draft constitution, he went on to lay out a vision for an assimilated India. He said, to diehards who have developed a kind of fanaticism against minority protection, I'd like to say two things. One is that minorities are an explosive force which, if it erupts, can blow up the whole fabric of the states. The minorities in India have agreed to place their existence in the hands of the majority. They have loyally accepted the rule of the majority, which is basically a communal majority and not a political majority. Therefore, it is for the majority to realize its duty not to discriminate against minorities. Whether the minorities will continue or will vanish must depend upon this habit of the majority. The moment the majority loses the habit of discriminating, the minorities can have no ground to exist. They will vanish. So with this very small introduction, I conclude and I request Dr. Mohan Gopal to address the gathering.
Professor Mustafa, Vice Chancellor Nalsar, Ashok, and the other participants who organized this event, my dear students. First, let me begin by thanking Ashok and his team and the Vice Chancellor for giving me this privilege of being able to share some thoughts in an event associated with Dr.B.R.Ambedkar. I think that is an extraordinary honor. And to be able to do so on his 122nd birth anniversary is also a very timely and a very rare privilege and honor. All anniversaries are occasions for reflection and commitment. And there can be no doubt that there are very few people who were as committed to the central question that occupies this country even today as Dr. Ambedkar was, and that is, how can we end the needless suffering of millions and millions of people in this country? You may agree or disagree with Dr. Ambedkar, but you cannot escape this question to which he devoted his life. He lived and breathed this dilemma. I don't think there is any other place on earth where as many people suffer injustice, deprivation, poverty, the denial of basic human facilities and dignity. In the face of such enormous disparity and inequality as in the subcontinent today. And this has gone on for centuries. And while other parts of the world, including China, very recently Western Europe, North America, have been able to considerably reduce the scale and extent of human suffering. We have failed to do so. And I think it is a great failure of my generation that we failed to make a dent on injustice in this country. The flame, the battle now passes on to you. So the best way we can pay tribute to Dr. Ambedkar today on his 122nd birth anniversary is to use his work and life and reflection to rededicate ourselves and yourselves to the struggle that we must, as quickly as possible, bring a permanent end to the enormous suffering of so many millions of people in our country. And if today's deliberations can offer some insight and some value to even one or two of the people who have taken the trouble to be here today on a Sunday morning, then I think this time would be worth it. So I'm here to speak and reflect, thinking about the future, and in the hope that sitting in this room is a young student as Dr. Ambedkar was in 1916 in Columbia University, presenting a paper on caste in India, their mechanism, genesis and development, which was delivered in May 1916, 20 years before the annihilation of caste. He was a student, 25 years old. And those reflections have come to have a profound impact on India and indeed the future course of humanity. So I am confident that sitting in this room is someone in his or her 20s who will also make a very profound impact on this core problem. How can we end injustice in this country? Now, Dr. Ambedkar's work and life was of particular relevance to us as students of law, because while there were others who worked on social reform, they did not address directly political reform as Dr. Ambedkar had done. They were social reformers. And there were political reformers like Nehru who sought political and economic reform but stayed away from the realm of social reform. Dr. Ambedkar transcended not only social reform and political reform but also gave centrality to the use of law as an instrument of social and political reform. And he was unique in that respect. And he was not even a lawyer. Very few people realize that the single largest bulk of courses he took at Columbia University was in economics. So if anything you can say he was an economist. He took courses in political science, but he was not a lawyer. So using law was not, unlike some of us, a parochial act. That we are lawyers, we are trained in law, therefore we see centrality to law. From an objective perspective, as a thinker, he saw some potential in the law. And he made law a central, not the only, but a central instrument that he would use to bring about social change in this country. And therefore it is incumbent on us as students of law to really understand why is it that Dr. Ambedkar used law as such a central instrument in social change. And for us, 6 decades after the Constitution, to be able to reflect, was this successful or not? And if it was not successful, then what can we do as people who are responsible for thinking about law? What can we do to take forward this cause and use law in the interest of bringing about an end to injustice in this country? So this is the central question that I'd like to explore with you today. The elusive quest to end human suffering in this country, which was the central quest of Dr. Ambedkar, and the role of law in bringing about success in this quest. This is what I'd like to explore with you today. I'll speak for a few minutes and then we can have some interaction, because that's always more interesting. And when I speak, I will try to explore what I understand to be the philosophical underpinnings and the assumptions that lie behind the use of law as an instrument of social change by Dr. Ambedkar. Now, we celebrate Dr. Ambedkar as the father of the Constitution of India, as the chair of the drafting committee. So let's start by asking ourselves, what is the Constitution? Traditionally, a constitution is seen only as an administrative document that sets out, establishes political institutions, administrative institutions, and allocates power amongst these different institutions. It is seen primarily as an instrument of governance. That's sort of at the intersection of administration and politics. The Supreme Court of India said in S.P. Gupta in 1982 that the Constitution of India is an instrument of social revolution. And there was in that period, and actually today I must also pay tribute to Justice Chinnappa Reddy, who passed away yesterday, one of the 4 great judges, 1973 and 1987, a 14-year period, which was a period of epochal change for the Indian judiciary. 1973 was the year, on the same day on which Justice Krishna Iyer and Justice Bhagwati came into the Supreme Court. Justice D.A. Desai came afterwards, and Justice Chinnappa Reddy later, and Justice Chinnappa Reddy was the last of the 4 to retire in 1987. So it's a 14-year period which actually brought about fundamental change in the Indian judicial system. So from that 1973 period, which was, in fact, it began in the shadow of the supersession of the 3 judges. In fact, Justice Krishna and Justice Bhagwati were sworn in weeks after the supersession of the 3 judges. It was a tumultuous period for the Indian judiciary, when the idea of a judiciary committed to constitutional values, which was an idea that Mohan Gopal, a great leader who came from the communist movement into the Congress party, had put on the table in public debate in this country. So in that period, we started suddenly to see the constitution in a very different way. For the first 23 years from 1950 to 1973, the constitution was seen as a very conservative document, and in fact MC Setalvad, in his introductory remarks at the inauguration of the Supreme Court, he said the constitution is but an instrument, is only an instrument that will define how this country is governed. And that kind of Setalvadian view, conservative view, dominated for 23 years. And that was not surprising, because it was not until, I believe, 1966 when India had its first Chief Justice of India, who had not been selected by the British to serve as a High Court judge under the British in colonial times, who had the task to put freedom fighters in jail rather than fight for freedom. So it was almost 20 years after independence that India got finally a Chief Justice of India who had not been a servant of the Crown in his capacity as a Supreme Court judge. So that was the atmosphere, and the constitution was seen as an administrative instrument. But suddenly in 73 these judges come in, and they look at the constitution and say, this constitution is a charter for social revolution, drawing on the work of Glanville Austin, political scholar who's written 2 books on the making of the Indian Constitution, who was the one who actually portrayed the Constitution as an instrument of social revolution, and this was picked up by these judges and put in the Supreme Court judgment. So suddenly we saw the Constitution as an instrument of social change, and the judiciary as an arm of social revolution. Exact words of the Supreme Court in S.P. Gupta. And then you start to look at the preamble, part 3 and part 4 and part 4a, in a completely different way. And as you know, I ask for the forgiveness of Professor Faizan, because what I'm now going to say I spoke a little bit when we were at another occasion together recently. But the first objective of the Republic in the preamble is to secure justice, social, economic and political. Now when you took a conservative view of the Constitution, you saw justice as really an unremarkable concept, like, happiness. It's what the Americans would call motherhood and apple pie, it's something everyone will talk about as an unremarkable concept. But justice is there not only in the first objective of the preamble, but it is there in Article 39 small a, Article 39 capital A, which says the operation of the legal system the state shall ensure that the operation of the legal system promotes justice on the basis of equal opportunity. Article 39, which says that the state shall ensure that the justice, social, economic and political shall inform all the institutions of national life. So the idea of justice is very much written into the Constitution, but was never really focused on. And for most judges, justice simply meant decisions of courts consistent with the law, where the judge is not biased or prejudiced and the integrity of the process is maintained. That outcome is justice. But then we had to ask ourselves, how do you reconcile the fact that the Chief Justice M.C. Chagla, when he inaugurated a memorial at the same room where Tilak had been tried in the Bombay High Court, referred to the trial of Tilak and said what happened in that trial was blatant injustice. There was no complaint that Tilak's trial had not been considered the law. there was no complaint that any procedure had been violated. So how could a Chief Justice describe the result of a judicial proceeding as injustice, blatant injustice, if there was no demonstrable non-compliance with law or procedure or integrity? So clearly we cannot view justice simply as an administrative concept, as a procedural concept. So can we expand the idea of justice to say justice also means respect for rights? So we bring in the idea of substantive due process and say it is not simply a question of procedural compliance, it's also a question of respecting human rights. And we could say that, could we then argue that Tilak's rights were not respected, but in fact, according to the law that prevailed, his rights were also respected. So if justice is simply a set of rights, simply a set of procedures, then why give it so much importance? So we have to understand justice in a new light if we understand the Constitution as an instrument of social change and social revolution. What is the way to do that? And I argue that the way to understand justice is a completely different way. And that is the following. That to understand the word justice, you must start with the word use, J-U-S. And use means right norm or right value. Now you could, with a little bit of, if you stretch the etymology, you could say STICE, S-T-I-C-E, stands for stand. Solstice, armistice, it means stand. So if you combine use and stis, you understand that justice means the use, the norms that stand forever. Stis means stand still. We said stand, but it means stand still. Armistice is stand still, or the army solstice is sun standing still. So justice means the values that stand forever, that are eternal. So justice actually simply means, etymologically, simple terms, eternal values. So when the Constitution says to secure to ourselves justice, social, economic and political, what the Constitution means is that we want to establish a society where social, economic and political values, relationships, social, economic and political relationships are governed by eternal values. And when Article 39 capital A says that the state shall secure that the operation of the legal system promotes justice on the basis of equal opportunity, it means that the operation of the legal system will promote eternal values. When Article 39A says that the state shall ensure that it shall strive to secure a social order in which justice, social, economic and political shall inform all the institutions of national life, what it means is that all institutions of national life shall be informed by eternal values. So suddenly you see the purpose of the Republic, not just the Constitution, the purpose of the Republic as securing and promoting eternal values. Now we have to ask ourselves, why this Constitution is focusing on promoting eternal values, and what is the content of these values? Now each of us can have our own view on what are eternal values, and therefore the content of the idea of justice can change from one person to the other. But clearly when the Constitution refers to justice as a set of eternal values, the Constitution is referring to the eternal values that are set out in the Constitution, not some other eternal values. So we have to look inside the Constitution and its origins and purpose to understand what are the eternal values that the Constitution is trying to establish, and why is it important to establish a set of values. Here you find the answer in the annihilation of caste. And so a young scholar argued to me, said to me, that actually you find the conceptual origin of the Constitution of India in the annihilation of caste. That link had not been made. How do you link the idea that justice is a set of eternal values to the annihilation of caste? It is in the following manner. Dr. Ambedkar himself says, he summarizes in his correspondence with Gandhi over the book, he summarizes his argument in the annihilation of caste. His argument is basically, in his own words, 1. Caste has ruined the Hindus. 2. Reorganization of Hindu society on the basis of Chaturvarnya is impossible, and he explains why. 3. That reorganization of Hindu society on the basis of Chaturvarnya is harmful. 4. That Hindu society must be reorganized on a religious basis which would recognize the principles of liberty, equality and fraternity. He says this 14 years before the Constitution, that Hindu society must be reorganized on a religious basis which would recognize the principles of liberty, equality and fraternity. That 5, that in order to achieve this object, the sense of religious sanctity behind caste and varna must be destroyed. And 6, that the sanctity of caste and varna can be destroyed only by discarding the divine authority of the Shastras. And then in the earlier part of his lecture, he argues, if you read it, and I'm sure you have, that the authority of the Shastras must be replaced by a new set of moral values set out in an instrument of the state. That is the Constitution. Now he could not achieve his goal or ambition of declaring the content of Shastras illegal. It was impossible given the the distribution of power in the society. But he achieved the second part, which was to create a state instrument that provided the Hindu society a new set of values based on liberty, equality and fraternity. And that is why the Constitution is focused on the idea of justice, because justice offers the Hindus of this country, all citizens, but particularly the Hindus, because, and we'll come to that, he traces the root problems of the society to the wrong values in the Hindu scriptures. He offers the Hindus of this country an alternate set of values, of religious values, of social values. And that is why promoting these values, securing these values, becomes a fundamental responsibility of the Indian state. Only if you read 3 things, for me, will you understand Ambedkar in its totality? A minimum of 3 things. I don't understand Ambedkar in its totality. I'm a very humble sort of student of Ambedkar. There are many who understand it much more than me. But in my limited understanding, you must read his 1960, which I refer to you as a 25-year-old student, castes in India, their mechanism, genesis and development. You must read The Annihilation of Caste, and you must read the Constitution of India. These three texts are part of one agenda and one diagnosis. So now you understand why the Constitution of India has become an instrument of social reform. Because it is part of the effort to destroy the Shastric, the belief in the Shastric and traditional values, and to replace it with a new set of values, which are eternal values. And Ambedkar refers to these values as eternal values always, values of the Constitution. That is why justice must be understood as eternal values. And after all, what is a nation? What is a republic? What is a society? Ambedkar repeatedly says, he says people come together around a culture and a set of values. A nation is not buildings, it is not soil. The nation is only soil, sacred soil. It is not soil. It is not buildings. A nation is only a set of shared values. And so when we say new republic nation, what we are saying is we are building a new set of values. What they try to do in partnership with Nehru, from their own perspectives, but they are actually, in my view, allies. Without Nehru, Ambedkar would never have been able to get the Constituent Assembly to adopt the Constitution of India, because Ambedkar was isolated in the Constituent Assembly. What the two of them are trying to do is to create in India, for the first time in human history, a society which has equality and material prosperity without injustice. There is no society on earth that has built up material prosperity and equality without injustice through non-violent constitutional means. Nehru had an economic agenda, Ambedkar had the social agenda. To construct that new society. This is the great and exciting journey of this country. And if India succeeds, there have been many countries that have built enormous material prosperity, but on the basis of enormous historical injustice and current injustice. There have been societies that have built up equality. Communist countries, Costa Rica, Sri Lanka, Kerala to some extent, but without material prosperity. Can we have material prosperity and equality, but without injustice? Maybe it's not possible, but this is, the Constitution is this project. Therefore, to understand the Constitution and the role of law, we have to really more deeply understand Ambedkar's understanding as well as other understandings, but today let's focus on Ambedkar's understanding of what is the problem with the country, why are we where we are, and how can we solve this terrible injustice that we are inflicting on vast numbers of our people in this country. Why have we ended up here? In the annihilation of caste, it is a direct assault on the Hindu religion, such that they, as you know, they disinvited him and said, please don't come. They used the excuse that you said you're now walking out of the Hindu religion, you're no longer a Hindu, so why do you want to talk to us? Hindus don't come. But the real reason was, as is evident in the earlier correspondence, that he was actually launching a tremendous attack on the content of the Vedas and on Varnashrama Dharma and on caste. But to understand this, to my mind, you have to go back to 1916 to 25-year-old Ambedkar, who explains what is caste in an absolutely brilliant way. It's stunning that a young 25-year-old has this kind of into this vast subcontinent. There, and I would comment that you should read it carefully, but just within the constraints of time, to summarize it, Ambedkar basically makes a very interesting proposition. He says, yes, Indians are said to have, he didn't say it as his own view, said to have multiple racial origins, Dravidians and Aryans and all these things. He doesn't give it much importance. He said, okay. But he argues very strongly, and this is one of the most important but neglected ideas of Ambedkar. He says, Indians are one people, culturally. He says it is only culture that unites people, and Indians are one people. Very ironical that the most powerful argument made for the unity of India does not come from the right, it comes from Ambedkar. No one else has argued with the power and conviction that Ambedkar has repeatedly that Indians are one people with one culture. Now he says, how did this happen? You had diverse origins, but now you have one culture and one people across this country. There are superficial appearances of differences, but we are one people. He says this happened because the Indians across the subcontinent have a culture of exogamy and not endogamy. So he says, look at Indian cultures. Almost all parts of India have rules against endogamy. And endogamy is not tolerated. It is a sin. It is unforgivable. Even today, look at the Khak Panchayats. You marry within your Gotra, will kill you. But he says, caste is nothing but endogamy, as you know. You can only marry within your group. So he says a culture of people that practiced exogamy, and through that exogamy fused their culture and became one culture and one people. Through exogamy. And we can see that in ourselves. You look around, you see ethnically, geographically, racially, a very mixed, anthropologically, a very mixed population in this country. I'm from Kerala, I get mistaken to be Odia or Bengali or, North Indian or, depending on where I am. If I turn up in a kurta pajama in Lucknow, people will think I'm from UP. If I'm in Sri Lanka, they think I'm Sri Lankan, Why? Because Ambedkar says, because for centuries and centuries we have practiced exogamy, and through exogamy we have fused our multiple diverse racial origins and cultural origins, and we are one people. But suddenly an artificial idea of endogamy emerged and was forced upon this exogamous people. That's why he says it doesn't work, it breaks down. People are running away and marrying each other. I have a niece, my brother's daughter, who was at National Law School Bangalore and married, another National Law School student whose parents were half from Bengal and Canada, and she's from Kerala. So, they're all running off and marrying each other across all these barriers because that's in our DNA. We don't accept or respect any of these barriers. Right? And the parents are all quite forgiving. But if my niece had married her first cousin, or something prohibited by endogamy, then there would have been a serious reaction. Here, everyone was happy, no problem. They're doing very well now, and this is many years ago. So Ambedkar says that, look, this endogamy is not natural to us. It's being forced on us. And this endogamy, forced endogamy, has created all these divisions amongst us. And that has to be ended. How did this happen? Then he speculates. He argues that endogamy, he says, look, in ancient India, there were, like in all societies, naturally different classes of people. Some were priests, some were warriors, some were traders, and, like everywhere. But he argues that it was a much more fluid because of exogamy. There was always movement back and forth, and it was not at all a rigid classification. There was hardly hereditary, to the extent now even Supreme Court judgeship is hereditary. It was hereditary. But no more or no less the hereditary than Supreme Court judgeship now. So therefore, he said you had this was the reality in this country. Then he said at some point of time the Brahmins, in order to protect some subgroup amongst them, started to develop endogamy and put the fenced off others and said, now you will not marry anyone else. And given that the Brahmins are the intellectual leaders, he argues many times in his writing that the intellectual leaders are people in society because they actually influence how people think. They set norms, they validate norms, they approve norms. So the intellectual being part of the intellectual class, when they started practicing and enforcing endogamy, naturally many others started to practice it. And more endogamy developed. Naturally, the others had no option except to do endogamy. So if I wanted to marry someone outside my community, but all the other community doors were shut to me, then I had really no option except to marry my own community. So gradually, endogamy became stronger and stronger, became more and more ossified. And this endogamy also started to close the travel between these classes, created division between the classes, created inequality between the classes, created antagonism between the classes. And he says ultimately caste is nothing but endogamy, and you have to break down this endogamy if you have to end class in this country. This is his fundamental argument in 1916. And now if you look at reservations, for example, to have exogamy, you must have equality between different groups. See, exogamy becomes relevant because human beings are organized as different groups, and that is inevitable and universal. Human beings will always be, we are born into a family, that family will be connected with other families, and connected to geography, connected to history, to vocation, to trade. I mean, we even now have, India International Center as a community where all these ex-bureaucrats come and gather together. So human beings always form communities, right? Now, given that there are communities, if therefore exogamy becomes relevant because then you're marrying across these barriers of human communities, or he calls them classes. Now, if exogamy must take place, there must be some broad level of equality between these groups, otherwise you will not have exogamy. If there are huge differences in economic power, social power, culture, education, vocation, because humans also have the tendency to feel that I am not so bad, I may even be better than others. It's a natural human reaction. We have the ego, that ego gets portrayed into the ego of my community, my class. Everyone believes that we are better than others. So we don't like to then have relationships with groups that are greatly inferior to us. And so exogamy and fusion of a diverse people actually require some level of equality between the groups. And to have equality, every group must have its due share. And reservation, in my view, is not to be mistaken with affirmative action in the United States, which is a small, disempowered minority trying to be given assistance to overcome historical discrimination. Reservation in India is intended to address two concerns. One concern is to ensure, like in South Africa, that a very large section of people, 70–80% of people who have been pushed out of any kind of economic, social and political power get their due share. And I'll come back to that later. And the second is to ensure that there is no concentration of power, that there is equality between groups, so that everyone is maintained at some level with a due share, so that exogamy can take place, and that exogamy will lead to unity and fusion of the people of this country. So now you understand that from his understanding is the core problem with this in India is that endogamy, caste as an institution of endogamy emerged, and that endogamy has then divided people and then put some vast groups of people in great disadvantage and great deprivation. And unless we end the system of endogamy, we will not be able to overcome the deprivation of these people. Now we ask ourselves, what is the nature of this social structure that has emerged as a result of this endogamy? And there we have three important concepts to deal with, and one is economic class, the other is varna, and the third is caste or jati. Jati or caste, according to Dr. Ambedkar, was created as I said, as very closed groups by endogamy. But then he looks at varna. And as you know, in the Annihilation of Caste, he launches a massive attack on varna. He says varna is the most evil system of all. He says theoretically varna appears very innocuous. It simply says that people must be, you look at the worth of people, their aptitude, and then people are categorized according to their worth or their aptitude. Dr.Ambedkar has an aptitude to sing, so we treat her as a singer. And Sachin Tendulkar has an aptitude, used to have an aptitude to bat, and so we categorize him as a batsman. And so these are, he says, look, theoretically there's absolutely nothing wrong. But he says as a practical matter, this is not implementable. Because who can, I mean, Professor Amita Danda will not be able to easily precisely map the aptitudes of her students. She's had thousands of students. She can identify some aptitudes, but who can actually assess the aptitude of a person better than a teacher? And if a teacher cannot, who can? Or a parent cannot, who can? So he says this is not practical, this is not implementable. Secondly, he says this is all really just a false explanation, because if it was a serious system that people must pursue their varna, their guna, then there must be a system of punishment for not doing that. There was never a system of punishment. So if you're a Brahmin, you could do anything, and there was no system where you'd be punished for not being a priest or a scholar. And therefore he says this is not a serious system. It was never enforced, it's only an excuse. So he attacks varna very strongly, and he will destroy caste through destroying endogamy, through intermarriage. And he says varna has to be discredited through the removal of the legitimacy of the Shastras, from which the legitimacy and validity of varnas come to people. They must be destroyed, their legitimacy must be destroyed, and so you get rid of varna, you get rid of jati, and you have a society that is egalitarian. very logical, very logical framework. Now, if you take this framework and you look at the Constitution, come back to the Constitution again, then you will see how Dr. Ambedkar and Nehru have brought into the Constitution a new value framework, and Nehru, through the Hindu Code, has tried to push back endogamy. And not only Nehru but Ambedkar, who was the law minister, pushing back endogamy, creating equal rights, and trying to create a society which I think they were agreed on, which he describes in The Annihilation of Caste, and he says, what is, and I am now quoting from him, what is your ideal society if you do not want caste? Is a question that is bound to be asked of you. If you ask me, my ideal would be a society based on liberty, equality and fraternity. And then he explains these ideas. And he talks about the importance of liberty, of individual freedom. And that discussion of liberty, equality and freedom is an idea that is not simply an idea for the Dalits or the scheduled castes. He sees that as a foundation of a new society which will benefit every single individual. Every single individual, including the Hindu upper caste, the non-Hindus, the minorities, today's terms, the sexual minorities, they must all have individual liberty and equality and the right to make their own choice. No less than by creating a state religion, using religion not in the narrow conventional sense of the word, but by a new set of values for a new society moving forward. The Constitution came into effect. And Mr. Setalvad referred to the Constitution as it is but an instrument, without realizing that it was really social change and social reform, with a lot of limits, but still pushed for social change and social reform. And I must say, looking back over that period, Zamindari was abolished, banks were nationalized. There was a period in which there was a forward movement in the shift of power from the oligopoly that controlled power to a better spread of power in the society, still highly concentrated, but there was a movement in that direction. Then came the 70s, when for some time there was actually a symphony between the social and political side and the judicial side, with especially these 4 judges, who were affectionately called the Gang of 4 by their admirers. And they also pushed the agenda forward. They brought about big change in the legal and judicial system. But starting from the 1990s, 87, Chinnappa Reddy leaves the court, and that is when the world starts to move into collapse of the Soviet Union. New world order emerges, unipolar world, economic crisis, globalization, all this happens, and now we are in a new phase. What is that phase and how do we understand it in relation to the core struggle with which we are concerned today, and that is, how do we end the injustice that millions of our fellow citizens suffering from. And what has happened in the 1990s, in my view, is that the judiciary and the bar has not gone back to the original phase of being against social change. Their own composition has changed. Actually, the bar and the bench have become relatively more democratic than they were in the 50s and the 60s. But what some of them or many of them are now doing, in my view, is they are saying, let us achieve social change through another path, and that path is growth and integration with the global economy. The Constitution's theory that we have seen, a combination of Nehru's socialism and Ambedkar's understanding of Indian society, was to bring about social change by substituting the traditional social values with a new set of social values. The new Dharma Shastra was the Constitution, based on liberty, equality and fraternity. An attack, a direct frontal attack on the Varna system, where the government through various schemes actively promoted people to have freedom of employment, freedom of choice, break down all these barriers, economic and other barriers that they faced. So an assault on the Varna system, increasing emphasis and rights to give people Special Marriage Act, Hindu Code reform, to break down endogamy and promote schemes to give people reward for intercaste marriages. You get an extra however if you have an intercaste marriage. We all grew up in that marriage myself. You all grew up.
Did you get the extra half?
No, I didn't. I got nothing. Except a good wife, of course. And children who simply don't understand, who are living proof of Ambedkar's thesis, who don't understand what caste they belong to. So, we had a strategy to break down caste, break down Varna. And on the economic side, we had a constitution that reflected Nehru's philosophy, no concentration of wealth. The material resources of the community shall be so distributed as to best subserve the common good. Commanding heights of the economy held by the public sector. Opening up employment. Fighting discrimination. Gradually expanding rights. So we had an approach in the Constitution based upon the intellectual origins of a deep understanding of Indian society, based on Nehru's own understanding of Indian society, which you can link back, in my view, to Marxist ideas. Marx wrote in 1856, I believe it was, on India, in essence, that the railways would bring about industrialization, and industrialization would destroy caste. Marx also saw, like Ambedkar, 100 years, not 100 years, 50 years or so before, half a century before Ambedkar. Marx also saw caste as the #1 problem facing India and responsible for India's ruin. But he argued that industrialization would destroy caste. Nehru believed in the same idea, and Nehru promoted industrialization to destroy caste. Ambedkar promoted exogamy to promote caste, and an attack on Varnas and the replacement of the Shastras with a new set of scriptures called the Constitution. So this is all going in a very systematic direction. Now our judiciary comes and elements of our executive come and replace this whole thing with a new approach. And that new approach is based also on a theory of the market. That it's the market-based change that will bring about social reform, and it goes back also to the idea that economic reform and political reform should drive social reform or will drive social reform, rather than social reform being a precondition to economic and political reform. And that, as Ambedkar discusses in his Annihilation of Caste, is an old argument in the Indian freedom movement. Which comes first? And that was an argument where perhaps Nehru and Ambedkar may not have agreed. And Nehru may have felt that political and economic reform will produce social reform, and Ambedkar firmly believed that without social reform there will be no political and economic reform. So the market-based approach actually takes the Indian state away from the constitution's assumption that social reform is, if not a precondition, at least a necessary parallel reform to political and economic reform, and neglects the whole issue of social reform. And does not understand, for example, why we have reservation. And forgets the fact that our great goal is to establish a just society economy. And to respond, for example, to a concern and honor a pledge made to a Dalit member of the Constituent Assembly who got up in 1946 or 47 and made a speech in which he said, before 1947, so it was in 46, before August 1947, where he said everyone is happy that the British are leaving. I am also happy that the British are leaving. But let me say on behalf of 70 to 80% of the oppressed castes of this country, that we are afraid that for the first time in this country, in 1,000 years, 800, 900 years, the Hindu caste, upper caste is coming back to power. What will happen to us? Will India happen? We don't want that to happen. He said the Muslims did not want to live in this new dispensation. They asked for a different country, they got it. What asked? He said in his speech, he says, no group of people are more entitled to ask for partition and a new country than the lower caste of this country. But we know that if we ask for partition, there will be nothing left of this country. So we are not asking for it, but he said we want our due share. We know that if we don't, that the upper caste will not give us our due share. And we want our due share of three things, he said: employment, education and the legislature. So there was a huddle. The upper caste leadership was very concerned by this emerging demand for partition of India along caste lines. And no less than a committee, minorities committee headed by Sardar Patel, came back to the Constituent Assembly with a promise that you will have your due share. Give us 10 years and the undue share of the Hindu upper caste will be reduced and the Avarnas will get their due share. In legislature, and that you got through the Pune Pact, in education and in employment through reservations. That as of 2012, 93% of the members of the board of directors of the top 1,000 companies of India, accounting for over 2/3 of the market capitalization of this country, come from only Vaishyas and Brahmin and communities. Two castes. 60 to 70% of the Supreme Court is Hindu upper caste. If you look at Parliament, 40 to 50% from most parties, if you remove the lower caste parties and you remove the reserve constituencies, 50-60% of the seats are controlled by Hindu upper caste. If you look at education, you look at employment, there is today not a single Supreme Court judge from the SC community. I am told there is not even a single secretary to government from the scheduled caste community.
There is one now.
Now they have created one because
the Minority Affairs Ministry has got it.
Yeah, because there was a huge hue and cry for the last several months. But it's a very pathetic situation if you have to say we have one. And that goes all the way down. 60 years later, there has been no withdrawal from the undue share. And there has been no due share. So these constitutional mechanisms have been put in place in order to bring about social transformation and build a new society based on the values of equality and liberty and fraternity. Very well thought through. And we cannot midstream withdraw from this journey. It's like you're flying from Hyderabad to Delhi and midway through you say, I want to get off the plane. You can't. You're on a flight. You have to wait for the flight to land. So the challenge before us is to deeply understand the causes, not the symptoms, the poverty that we see, the deprivation that we see, the discrimination that we see, whether of women through patriarchy, whether of lower caste through the Varnashrama Dharma and the caste system, whether of individuals by all kinds of groups that are anxious to maintain the power of the groups over individuals, whether of the disabled, whether of the sexual minorities, are all manifestations of some fundamental underlying ideas and social institutions which need to be transformed if the reality in our country is to be changed and we are to end the unacceptable levels of injustice and poverty that prevail in our country. Dr. Ambedkar, Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, Narayana Guru, Basavanna, Jyotiba Phule, several great minds and great thinkers have given us several ways of understanding this reality, several explanations, and we must either act on their understanding and their explanation and move forward, or come up with our own understanding and our own explanation. But we must move forward in a mindful manner that will actually produce the result of altering our society and creating a new society based on equality and freedom. But we cannot leave that challenge aside and accept the kind of enormous inequality that is being increasingly sort of witnessed in this country, that will produce, as Ashok said, quoting Dr. Ambedkar in the beginning, nothing short of an explosion that is actually already taking place in this country. And I must express my hope and confidence that you, in a new generation, will reflect on these great traditions and legacy that we have from these great leaders on an occasion such as today, Dr. Ambedkar's birthday, which also happens to be Vishu for us in Kerala, and similar other nice festivals in other parts of the country, and to come up with new ways and new insights of taking forward this great journey, so that we will be able to realize Dr. Ambedkar's and Nehru's dream and Gandhi's dream, that we will build in this country a society that will have equality and prosperity but no injustice and no violence. So let me stop here and thank you very much for take any questions.
I request Professor Danda to present a bouquet. We now request Professor.
Dear students, you had such a treat, so I don't have anything to add, but since it's customary that the Vice Chancellor should also speak, howsoever ignorant he might be on a subject, I must also add few things. Now, this morning my difficulty with Professor Mohan Gopal is that in his lecture he was repeatedly using religious language. And I'm not an atheist, you know. I keep all my fast, and whenever I get time I do pray. But as a student of constitutional law, use of constitution as a scripture, as faith, it's problematic. And I'll show you in a minute. Of course, instead of picking up example of Indian constitution, which has not erected the wall of separation, which I think that we should have done it, I pick up the example from the US constitution. So you come across number of times statements in US constitution, my faith in the constitution is complete. This is a religious statement. Then similarly, when in a religion, what do you have? You would have a book, then you will have priests, so all these judges are priests, and the book is the constitution. And then you will have some rituals, so you have this swearing in, that swearing in. And that's why I know it is said that US is a big church at the top of that. And that's why, since they are the church, they are the religion, everybody else must follow. So the whole world must follow United States. I don't think we would like to have that kind of constitutional democracy in India. Now, since Prof.Mohan Gopal started with this theme that Dr. Ambedkar wanted justice and equality in the society and wanted to replace Shastras with some eternal values, I am in full agreement with it. That the constitution was a sort of a replacement, but whether it was itself some kind of a scripture, I have little reservations. But focusing on this theme, let me make one or two very small observations, and I am conscious of Madam's presence here. You see, of course, I am in agreement that Nehru wanted, economic justice, and Ambedkar wanted social justice, and it was these two who are able to give us such a nice constitution. But Nehru used secularism, which is something different. It's the neutrality of the state in terms of religion, to pacify minorities. Your places of worship would be protected, your laws would be protected, this and that. And that was not a great idea. Probably in the process, Nehru has violated the rights of all Muslim women. He referred to, the reforms in Hindu law. You are replacing Shastric law with more egalitarian, somewhat equal new law. But one big community was not given this benefit because we failed in including Uniform Civil Code in Part 3. That was a big failure. And 2, we gave freedom of religion. Of course, this is the only fundamental right which has been subjected to all other fundamental rights. If there is a conflict between 25 and 14, of course 14 would prevail. But you have judges, even in the definition of law, judges have said, personal laws are not included within the definition of law. And if personal laws are not laws, then the mandate of Article 13 does not help people who are living under personal laws. And similarly, by giving this freedom of religion, of course, the judges have said that we will decide what is an essential or non-essential aspect of your religion, which itself is, funny. Yet, you have this. So religion also continues in 25, and also because you don't have a uniform civil code. And by not having uniform civil code, rights of minorities within minorities are being violated. I understand on the question of minority rights, the Indian constitution is such a bold statement coming in the wake of partition. The mere belief, in fact he said that Ambedkar was for individual rights. I would say yes, he was for individual rights, but he was equally conscious of importance of group rights. That's why you have group rights for minorities, because individual rights are not sufficient. My right to equality or my right to free speech and liberty is not enough if Muslim community as such is a stereotype and is shown in a bad light. So I cannot exercise my individual right if group right is not given to me in the first place. And that's why you have group rights in our constitution. So Ambedkar was equally for group rights as well. Reference was also made to sexual minorities. Again, I have to say that there is an omission in Article 15. It is not there in the prohibited grounds. If you look at the modern laws now, specifically they say that state shall not discriminate on X, Y, Z ground, which would also include sexual orientation. And finally, I would say that reference was made to this no Dalit secretary in the government of India. Little bit, this is just try to understand, because this news was carried about 2 months back, and not many people really understood what makes and how Secretary Government of India is made. To be Secretary Government of India, if you have to look, you need to look at this Staff Selection Commission thing, Central Secretariat cadres. And in fact, most people from this cadre are not made secretaries. They would retire as maximum as joint secretaries. So most people who become secretaries to Government of India, they have to come from Indian Administrative Services. And for Indian Administrative Services, you are allotted a cadre in the state. So somebody would be from UP cadre, Andhra cadre, Maharashtra cadre. And from that cadre, people will keep coming on central deputation and going back for this cooling off periods. Therefore, to be a secretary to Government of India, you have to see whether this person has come at the director level, at the joint secretary level. Was he impaneled as additional secretary, then a special secretary, and then secretary? One may not agree with the eminent writer and the kind of controversy he created in Jaipur. Yet many officers do not, by saying that Indian Constitution would not be the way it is at the moment had Ambedkar and Nehru team, to which Professor Mohan Gopal made a reference, not been there in the Constitution. Of course, even going for Hindu reforms was quite a task. You had such an opposition from the President himself, and that's why the bifurcation. And the way the rights have been given to the minorities and to other marginalized sections is quite a statement. And I'll buy his thesis that, as he said it, he referred to our recent meeting, that the justice is stripping from the Constitution. And the reality is that still, we have domination of one or two castes. And I don't know how many more years it would take for us to have a truly just society. But if we continue to pay our tributes to Ambedkar and listen to such wonderful discourses, I'm sure that you people are going to occupy top positions. You would be far more just in your dealings, and this problem of discrimination would disappear from our society, maybe next 20 years, 30 years. Thank you very much.
Thought, there were so many and there was so much learning that I had through the whole morning. But I just wanted to expand further or elaborate further for our further contemplation, deliberation, dialogue, planning, envisioning, whatever you want to say. The point which Professor Mohan Gopal made about how Ambedkar's theorizing and his thinking cannot be seen as a concern only with his own caste or his own community. It was envisioning for a just society. And you can't really think in terms of, and it's like the kind of point that you can't really think in terms of creating justice for all till there is injustice for anyone. And I think that is something which this business of alliance building, this need to be looking at oppression everywhere, and it's so very important and significant that all manner of people experiencing whichever kind of oppression, if they alliance together, they always would be outnumbering the oppressors. The reason why this doesn't happen is what I think we need to be looking at. And if we start seeing the commonalities that you experience in the whole business of oppression, that we might be able to envision that just society. That we see that, okay, between caste and gender and disability and orientation and region, religion, I mean, you can keep picking up the reasons for which people get singled out and excluded. And if the excluded communities start joining hands together, that we create an alliance of the excluded, then possibly that's where one would be shaking up things. And I think that's the kind of an agenda that needs to be there for your generation. I think every generation fights its own freedom struggle, and it's important all the time to recognize that that struggle carries on, and it's important to keep creating agendas. I think when we celebrate our great thinkers, our great leaders, we do it basically to be sort of setting up our own agendas, and I think it's with that spirit that this day is celebrated at Nalsar. And I would want that if we go back from this, trying to work out exactly how that alliance building can be happening, how can we be challenging this so-called market-oriented model which believes that money can be more important than people, if we are, unless and until we have, and that's what universities are meant for, and that's what a morning of deliberation should be for. Professor Mohan Gopal, I think, has given us enough food for thought. Professor Mustafa typically has given the requisite provocation. I mean, he's the, like a catalyst in the system. He kinds of all the time excels in it, and did it again this morning. And I'm certain that you'll want to be having your question answers and questions. I mean, how Ashok is organizing that's for a show. And once again, I'm happy to be talking with you all. Thank you so much.
Good morning, sir. I'm Neha from 5th year. I beg to differ with Professor Faizan Mustafa on that I don't think it's a religious matter, it's a matter of faith. While religion is also faith, the matter here is not about the religion, the matter over here is the kind of faith that the Constitution of India gives you as a citizen to uphold your rights. One question from your lecture was, what is your opinion on the discourse between, because there's a definite approach as well as an idealistic difference between Mahatma Gandhi and Dr.Ambedkar. So if you could please elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful comment and wonderful question, and also the wonderful interventions by Professor Faizan and ma'am here. I want to, before I come to you, it's relevant to that, I want to also, you also raised the issue of religion. What is the issue of religion? But it is not my thesis, it's his thesis. He argued basically that, and I'm reading Ambedkar's words, people will not change their conduct until they cease to believe in the sanctity of the Shastras on which their conduct is founded. So you come to a conclusion. Now she talked about how she is treated as less. Now that is the social behavior we are looking at. Then we are saying, why are people behaving like this? So after deep study, Dr. Ambedkar comes to the conclusion, like many others, that this belief that somebody is superior and somebody is inferior will not change unless they cease to believe in the sanctity of the Shastras, because that is where this belief is coming from. Now if you say that in legal, political and social discourse we cannot talk of the Shastras, how will we solve this problem? And can we believe simply because there was an idea of secularism which of a particular type, we all believe in. Secularism is absolutely the way you mean it. I think everyone in this room fully agrees with that. That there should not be discrimination or injustice in the name of religion. And everyone, regardless of your religion, religion is a matter of faith in the private space. In the public space, you should be able to function without reference to religion. That we totally agree with. But here we are talking of social reform. And that's the main point I'm making, is let us understand that the Constitution is an instrument of social reform according to the Supreme Court of India. Not just according to Mohan Gopal. And according to Glanville Austin. and all these people. Now, if you say that the Constitution is an instrument of social reform, and if Ambedkar and everybody says that you cannot have social reform unless you change religious belief, I think we cannot interpret secularism to say you cannot talk of religious reform. That is a completely, with great respect, not the right understanding of secularism. Because then you are telling 80% of the people of this country, please continue to accept to be treated as inferior, and let those documents, those texts, those instruments which say that a woman and a Shudra and a lower caste is like a dog and so on, let them continue to be valid in this country. Let the Bhagavad Gita, which has many good things, continue to be valid even in that passage which says Chaturvarnya Maya Srishtam Guna Karma Vibhagasha, that I have created 4 varnas, God has created 4 varnas, dividing people according to their guna and their karma. So naturally you see a Brahmin, you say God has made this man superior of guna and superior of karma. Now, unless what Ambedkar is saying is, unless you can engage with this issue and change this belief system, social conduct is not going to change. And this constitution, okay, so then he goes on and he says, well, how should this reform be implemented? And he says, number 1, there should be one and only one standard book of Hindu religion acceptable to all Hindus and recognized by all Hindus. This of course means that all other books of Hindu religion such as Vedas, Shastras and Puranas, which are treated as sacred and authoritative, must by law cease to be so, and the preaching of any doctrine, religious or social, contained in the Vedas, Shastras and Puranas should be penalized. I am reading Ambedkar to you.
But that's not my take.
No. My point is, see, my point is that he's saying, how do you have injustice in India because of the religious beliefs of Hindus? This is his thesis. How do you get rid of the religious beliefs of Hindus? By doing this. By saying that, look, if you preach Vedas, Shastras and all that, you are going to be sent to jail. Right? Now, Ambedkar said this. It was not achieved. What was his lowest viable substitute option which he achieved? Created a constitution which has a new set of values and says this should substitute, at least for the Hindus, this should substitute the values that you believe in. Right? Now this is the bold experiment of social reform that he is trying to do. And he is trying to say, replace your set of values in the Shastras with the constitution. It is in that sense that I say that we have to understand that we have to struggle with the issue of religious reform just as Europe struggled with the issue of religious reform in the Protestant reform. What was the Reformation and the Renaissance from which secularism came? Without certain aspects of certain religions being reformed, when people of that religion come to the conclusion that there is no way forward, and one way forward is to penalize the preaching of those books, and that's not practicable, then we come up with another alternative. So we are trying to deal with a complex problem, as she said. We want to bring about an egalitarian society. We are fully accepting and respecting the fact that your religion should have nothing to do with the policies of the government, and that secularism in that sense of neither should the state interfere with faith, nor should faith interfere with the state. That is a absolutely sacrosanct principle. There is no questioning of that. But this is in the context of social reform, and the constitution is an instrument of social reform.
But my take is that constitution is indeed an instrument of social reform. We are saying you are replacing this set of values by this set of values.
The religious reform. We are trying to change religious belief. So in the sphere of religious belief, unless you challenge the religious reform and say your religion, only to the Hindus, you say that these must be your new values, then you will not achieve the social reform that he wants. This is what Ambedkar is arguing. Now clearly, this is a different approach to secularism. I would not say it is secularism versus non-secularism. It is how do you take a secular approach to the religious reform necessary to build a secular society. That is a challenge. And that there he has a perspective. That brings us to the Gandhi difference between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Gandhi, of course, was deeply plunged into religion and politics, and he completely, he openly said, what I've done is I've brought religion into politics, and he wanted religion to come into government, but from a different perspective, the perspective of creating equality. Because after all, what is religion? Religion, as you know, literally, is simply a set of beliefs to which you are bound. Religare means to bind. So any set of beliefs to which you are bound is a religion. And I think we have to understand deeply that religion has many aspects to it. Some aspects explaining what is God, how did the world, matters of spiritual explanation as to origin of humans, and the previous life and next life, and this kind of matter. So that's a matter of faith. Then religion also has a set of morality. Now, one delicate issue for us is, when you talk of uniform civil code, should we have a common set of morality that in this very diverse country? And Ambedkar is saying, yes, you must. And the common set of morality is based on equality, fraternity, liberty. And no one shall be allowed to take the strength of the group must result from the free individual. The individual cannot be the product of the group, is what Ambedkar believed. And so the free individual, and Gandhi also believed that, the free individual must be the atom on which the molecules are built and material is built, not the other way around. Now, the difference between Gandhi and Ambedkar, I think there are very important differences. Gandhi did not challenge Varnashram Dharma. Gandhi did not challenge the caste system the manner in which Ambedkar did. Gandhi defended the Hindu social order. But what I would like to say is that for Gandhi it was a tactical evolution. His main objective was to attack and convert the beliefs of the upper caste. And so he wanted to get their confidence so that he can engage with them. And his dialogue continuously changes. Unlike Ambedkar, who was consistent from age 25 or 20 upwards to the end of his life, complete consistency. Gandhi contradicted himself constantly, changed. He was a very confusing person to study. If someone gives you a quote of Gandhi, you have to ask, when did he say it, where did he say it, in what context did he say it, because he said all kinds of different things to different people. Based on truth and non-violence, taking care of the weakest and the poorest, and looking at the welfare of all, is the philosophy of the Dalits of this country. And Gandhi picked that up and took that forward. And that is a framework, I believe, that is very much at the heart of Ambedkar's thinking also. But Ambedkar took up the tough problem of how to change the Hindu religion to get here. Whereas Gandhi felt that by first tackling untouchability, he would then go on the path of Hindu social reform. Where he would have gone if he had not been killed by the Hindu right. There were 5 attempts on Gandhi's life. One was successful. All 5 attempts were by Chitpavan Brahmins. Why did the Hindu upper caste want to kill Gandhi so desperately? Because they knew that he was now going to turn from throwing the British out to reforming and bringing in egalitarian society amongst the Hindus and in this country generally. But very complex thinking on the part of Gandhi, not straightforward like Ambedkar in explaining his positions like in the passage I read out to you. But I think we have to engage in all these people's thinking to really understand for yourself, how India and how to understand these problems and move forward. But the consensus amongst Gandhi, Nehru and Ambedkar is ultimately we want a society where every individual enjoys liberty and equality and dignity and is not, regardless, and no group, no culture, no ideology, no religion can impose its views and values on you. mean, that these three, I think, are fully agreed. But how they get there, I think, is different. And I think Ambedkar had an extraordinarily sort of sophisticated understanding of Indian society and how to get there. Except that, you know, there's not much implementation of his ideals, and that's the problem.
I just wanted to add a line to what you were saying, because I also think that debates that happen between, you know, Ambedkar and Gandhi, between Ambedkar and Nehru at different points of time, it somewhere is about, and I think that's extremely critical for us to be a functioning democracy, as to how to agree and disagree, and how in that agreement and disagreement to keep moving forward. We don't have to polarize and dichotomize our understanding of. If we do not do that, then I think we gain from both. And Ambedkar himself was continuously, even in dissent, he was in engagement. And I think it's that which needs to be sort of somewhere, we're losing that. You know, we always make an either-or choice, either you're here or you're there. And the fact that he had this somewhere, if we do not want to be creating another country, which is the point, we want to be living in this country together, then it's so very important to be having this dialogue, understanding from both sides exactly, you know, what is it that it means to be reaching a place where all of us can flourish. And I think that's fascinating in most of the major leaders of the freedom movement. And I would somewhere think that amongst the things which is fascinating also for all of us in the Constituent Assembly debates is the manner in which, while Ambedkar is standing where he is standing, he's continuously talking with people on where he wants them to reach. And I think we haven't done enough in terms of, we sort of polarize too fast, we take positions too soon, we don't listen enough, and maybe that's in itself a huge learning from somebody who was a great talker.
But I would like to having agreed with everything that you've said, I would like to say that there is one very, very important issue on which there is flat-out disagreement between Gandhi and Ambedkar, and Nehru is agnostic on this, and that is the status of the Vedas and the Shastras. Now, Ambedkar is very clear that these documents are wrong and have no sanctity and no legitimacy. Nehru, as an atheist, he did not believe in the Vedas and Shastras. But Gandhi, and in this response to, he says there's a lot of smritis and shrutis and all that which are rubbish. I don't believe in all of this. But I do believe in that part of the Vedas that says there is only one God and ahimsa is the only way. That I believe. And he does believe that that has religious validity and so on. Whereas Ambedkar doesn't accept that. Now, Narayana Guru is in fact the most powerful of all these social reformers, because he brought about delivered actual amazing change in Kerala. He takes a different approach, much closer to Ambedkar, and he had come to the conclusion that it is the belief in the validity of the Vedas and the sanctity of the Vedas that is the key change that has to be brought about in Indian society. And that is what he tackled, and he succeeded in doing that for the Dalits. Most of the Dalits, hardly any Dalits believe in the sanctity of the Vedas. If other Hindus also, according to Ambedkar, move to that situation, then the inequality will end. But years of the application of their work, we can't treat them like gods or prophets and say that whatever they said was right and must have worked, because we can now test their theories against reality. That's what Ambedkar would have wanted us to do. He would have wanted us to test whether his own ideas worked or did not work. So it is up to all of you to be looking at all these issues of social reform, accept that social reform is the key challenge for us, look at different experiences. Jyotiba Phule was another amazing intellectual, amazing ideas. Who did Jyotiba Phule fight for more than many other groups? He fought for Brahmin widows and their rights, to protect them, because he saw them as human beings, not as Brahmins. So we have a lot of these examples. Basavanna in Karnataka. So we can look at all this and study in the current context, in the future context, and find a way forward. But I believe personally, based on my own experience in Kerala, that ultimately the view that all these differences, religious, caste, are all, not that they don't have a place, but they are not valid social categories, is the most powerful view, that we are all just human beings and we should reject all these other social categories and embrace each other as one species and one humanity. That is the way forward, and that's where they all ultimately agree.
Thank you so much.